The cradle beside my bed was empty, and someone had made it up with fresh linen while I slept. I could smell the lye soap on the sheets, sharp and clean, though my hands had not touched water since the baby came. My body still ached from the birth. I could not sit up without gripping the bed frame. At the foot of the bed, the chest where I kept the quilt I had sewn stood open, and the quilt was gone. A girl I barely knew looked in, said the baby was settling in nicely at the other house, and left before I could ask which house she meant. My name is Miriam, and I grew up inside a quiet Amish community where a woman learned early that peace was worth more than answers. I am telling this the way I lived it, slowly, the way it happened to me. If stories about the hidden rules inside closed families move you, stay with me and consider subscribing, because I share these accounts one careful piece at a time. Before we go further, I want to ask you something specific, not about your pain, but about your noticing. Has there ever been a moment when everyone around you seemed to know a decision that concerned you while you were the last to hear it? I lay there a long while trying to make the empty cradle mean something ordinary. Maybe the baby was crying and they had taken her so I could rest. Maybe they were warming her by the stove downstairs. But the cradle was not just empty, it was cold and neatly dressed, the way you leave a bed you do not expect to use again soon. I called out, and no one came. I heard footsteps in the hall, then a door, then the low murmur of women's voices deciding something without me. My throat tightened. I did not yet have a name for the fear, but I could feel its shape. When I finally got someone to come, it was my husband's younger cousin, a girl of maybe 14, carrying a cup of broth. I asked her plainly where my daughter was. She would not look at me. She said the baby was better off where there were more hands and that Aaron had carried her over first thing that morning. Over where? I asked. She flushed the way a child does when she has repeated something she was not meant to explain. To the other house, she said again, as if those 3 words were a full answer everyone but me already understood. Then she set the broth down and hurried out. I want you to understand how small I was in that moment, and I do not mean my body, though my body had never felt weaker. I mean my standing. I had married into a family that owned good land and held a respected name, and I had come to them with almost nothing. I had learned to be grateful, and gratitude in that house had a way of becoming silence. So when I first heard that my daughter had been taken to a house I had never seen, my very first feeling was not anger. It was the fear that asking too loudly would prove I did not belong. Still, I made myself move. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and felt the room tilt. I gripped the frame and waited for the floor to hold still. The window showed a gray morning, the kind that keeps its light low over the fields. Somewhere out there was a house with my child in it, and I could not have pointed to it on any road. I had lived in this district almost 2 years, and I thought I knew every home where our family visited. But no one had ever spoken of another house, not once, and now it held the only thing I had made that was truly mine. I got as far as the doorway before my husband's mother found me. She was a calm woman, silver hair pinned tight beneath her covering, and she had a way of speaking softly that made you feel loud simply for answering. She took my elbow, gentle as anything, and steered me back toward the bed. "You must not be up," she said. "You are still bleeding. You are not yourself. And there is no sense wearing yourself thin over what is already well handled." Well handled. I remember how that phrase settled over the room like a lid. Someone had handled it. Someone had decided. I asked her the only question that mattered. When is she coming back to me? My mother-in-law smoothed the blanket across my knees and did not answer straight. She said the baby was in good care, that I needed to heal first, that a mother who could barely stand had no business fretting over things that could wait. Every word she chose was reasonable. That was the trap of it, and it took me far too long to see. She was not refusing me. She was postponing me, gently, endlessly, and a postponement you cannot argue with becomes a wall you cannot climb. By evening, I had pieced together only fragments. The baby was healthy. Aaron had taken her before I woke. The women had prepared the other house, and no one would tell me whose house it was or how far. When Aaron finally came to my room, he sat on the edge of the bed and held my hand and would not meet my eyes. "It is only for a little while," he said, "until you are stronger." He said it the way a man recites something he has been given to say, and in the space between his words I understood, without proof, that this had not been decided that morning at all. I lay awake that night with my arms empty and my mind turning over one small, cold fact I could not explain away. The linens on the cradle had been fresh, but the quilt from my chest was gone, and a quilt does not simply wander off. I had sewn every stitch of it through the long months of waiting, cornflower blue and plain, meant for one child in one room. If the baby was only away for a little while, why take the quilt? Why strip my chest bare? I did not sleep. I only listened to the house settle around a decision I had never been asked to make, and I began quietly to plan how I would find that other house myself. I need to take you back before that morning, so you understand why an empty cradle could frighten me more than it might frighten someone else. I grew up the fourth of 7 children on a farm that never quite paid for itself. My father was a kind man who worked himself gray, and my mother sewed for other families to fill the gaps. We were not poor by the world's measure, but within our district there were homes that mattered and homes that were merely tolerated, and ours sat closer to the second kind. I learned young to keep my voice low, my hands busy, and my wants small. A girl like me did not expect to marry into land. So when Aaron began driving me home from the singings, I could hardly believe it. His family held one of the oldest names in the settlement, with acres that had passed down clean for 4 generations. His father had died when Aaron was a boy, and his mother had held the farm together with a will that everyone admired and no one crossed. When Aaron asked to court me, his mother invited me to supper and looked at me a long time across the table, the way you study a horse before you buy it. She smiled and told me I seemed like a sensible, quiet girl. I took it as the highest praise. I did not yet know it was a measurement. We married in the fall, and for a while I mistook my smallness for peace. I moved into the big house, into the room that had been Aaron's since boyhood, and I learned the rhythm of a household that ran on his mother's word. She rose first and slept last. She decided what we ate when we visited, which families we owed, and which owed us. Aaron deferred to her in everything, and because he was gentle about it, I told myself it was only respect for a widowed mother. In public, he was warm and attentive, and people spoke of us as a fine young couple. Inside those walls, my opinion was the lightest thing in any room. If you have ever lived in a home where the kindness and the control wear the same face, you already know how hard it is to name what is wrong. Nothing his mother did could be pointed to as cruel. She fed me well. She taught me her recipes. She sat with me on cold evenings and told me stories of the family. But every choice, down to the color of thread I bought, passed through her first. I began to ask permission for things I had decided freely my whole life, and the strangest part is that I felt grateful for the guidance because I had come from so little, and here was a woman offering me a place in something that had always stood. There had been a harder season too, one that everyone in the family spoke around rather than about. In my first year of marriage, I had carried a child and lost it before its time. I will not lay that grief out in detail, because it is not the kind of thing you spread on a table for strangers. But I will tell you that I grieved it hard, longer than the family thought seemly, and that my mother-in-law watched me weep and said very little. She was patient with my sadness the way you are patient with weather you expect to pass. When it did not pass quickly, something in how she looked at me changed. I felt it, though I could not have told you what it meant. There was one more thing I noticed and filed away without understanding. Aaron had a sister, married into a family 2 districts over, who had 3 children I had met only twice. Whenever her name came up, the women grew careful. Once I overheard my mother-in-law say that the girl had needed help early on, that the children had been better off staying with steadier relations while she found her feet. It was said the way you say something settled long ago. I remember thinking it was sad that a mother would be parted from her little ones, even briefly. I did not think it could ever touch me. I was steady. I was sensible. I had been chosen for exactly that. Now, lying in that bed with my arms empty, all these small things began to line up in a row I did not like the look of. The measuring stare at supper, the patience that soured when my grief ran long, the sister whose children had been better off elsewhere, the other house that everyone but me seemed to know. I had spent 2 years making myself easy to live with, and I had mistaken that ease for belonging. But belonging, real belonging, does not require you to ask where your own daughter has been taken. It does not leave you the last to know. The next morning, I resolved to stop being managed and start asking directly. My body was still weak, but my mind had cleared overnight into something hard and useful. I would not accept broth and soft words in place of my child. I would ask Aaron plainly to bring the baby back into this room by nightfall, and I would watch his face when he answered. If it was truly only for a little while, as he kept saying, then a little while could begin today. I pulled myself upright against the headboard, listened to the house waking below me, and waited for the sound of my husband's boots on the stairs. He came up mid-morning, smelling of the barn, and I asked him before he could settle into his usual softness. "I want her back in this room today," I said. "I can nurse. I can hold her. I am her mother, and she belongs where I am." Aaron sat down slowly, turning his hat in his hands, and I saw him choose caution over answer. "She is being well looked after," he said. "There are more hands over there, and you are not strong yet. It would be a strain on you." I told him I would decide what strained me. He looked at the floor. He did not argue. He simply did not agree, and I was learning that his not agreeing was a door that never opened. I pressed harder because something in me had woken and would not lie back down. "More hands," I repeated. "Whose hands? Where is this house? Aaron said it was family, that I would meet them when I was up to it, that there was no cause to rush. Every answer was a fog I could not walk through. I asked him to at least bring her here for the nursing, so my milk would not fail. He hesitated at that, and for a moment I thought I had found the crack. Then he said his mother thought it better I rest and let the baby take to a bottle for now, so I would not tire. His mother thought. Not the midwife, not the doctor. His mother. That was the sentence that turned the fear cold and specific. A woman's milk does not wait politely to be scheduled around a household's convenience. To keep it, a mother must feed her child, and everyone raised near babies knows this. Yet the arrangement was built, quietly, to keep me from doing the one thing that would tie the baby to me and me to the baby. I did not say this to Aaron. I had learned that showing him my reasoning only gave his mother something to smooth over later. Instead, I nodded, as if considering it, and watched him relax, relieved that I had become manageable again. Inside, I was counting the hours my body could hold what it had made. When he left, I got up and crossed to the chest at the foot of the bed. I do not know why I kept returning to it. The baby was gone, but it was the empty chest that I could not leave alone. I lifted the lid and looked at the bare bottom where the quilt had lain, folded for weeks, waiting. I ran my hand across the wood as if the quilt might have slipped beneath a seam. It had not. Someone had taken it deliberately, folded it, carried it out with the child, and that small theft told me more than all of Aaron's soft answers. You do not send bedding after a baby you plan to bring home in a day or two. I dressed myself slowly and made it to the top of the stairs, holding the rail with both hands. I meant to go down, to walk out the door, to find the other house on foot if I had to. But my legs shook and the steps swam, and before I had gone 3 of them, the 14-year-old cousin appeared below and called for my mother-in-law in a bright, careful voice. Within a minute, the older woman was at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at me with that same soft concern. "You will fall," she said. "You will tear yourself and bleed, and then what use will you be to anyone? Come down slowly and sit by the stove. There is no need to go anywhere." She helped me down and settled me in a chair with a blanket over my knees, and it was done so tenderly that anyone watching would have seen only a good woman caring for a weak one. But I understood, sitting there wrapped and warm, that I had just tried to leave and been gently returned, and that the gentleness was the fence. I asked her as calmly as I could manage when I might walk over to see the baby. "When you are stronger," she said, "and not before, for the roads are rough and you are in no state." She said it kindly. She always said everything kindly. That was the thing I could not make Aaron understand, because to him it looked like love. I sat by that stove most of the day and watched the household move around me, and I began to see how carefully my world had been narrowed without a single harsh word. I was not forbidden anything. I was only discouraged, cared for, steered. If I reached for the door, someone was there to worry about my health. If I asked a direct question, someone answered with my well-being instead of the truth. The wall around me was built entirely out of concern, and concern is almost impossible to fight, because to fight it is to seem ungrateful, and to seem ungrateful in that family was the worst thing a young wife could be. By evening, my chest ached in the particular way a nursing mother knows, and I understood that time was not on my side. Every day the baby drank from a bottle in that other house was a day my body would begin to forget her. I did not know yet whose house it was, or how they had prepared it so quickly, or why the quilt had gone ahead of me. But I knew now that this was not a kindness I had misread. It was a plan, moving on schedule, and I was the only one in the house who had not been told the schedule. That night, I stopped asking permission in my head and started asking who exactly I would have to get past. The days that followed narrowed around me like a drawstring pulled slowly. Visitors who might have come to see the new baby were turned away at the door with soft explanations that I needed rest, that the birth had been hard on me, that I was not yet up to company. I heard these excuses given from my chair by the stove, and each one sealed me a little further inside the house. I told myself they meant well. I told myself a dozen times a day that I was being ungrateful, that a weaker woman would be glad of the fussing, that my mother-in-law had raised sons and buried a husband and surely knew more than I did about what a body needed after childbirth. But my body knew things too, and my body was telling me I was being kept from my child on purpose. My milk was already thinning, my strength returning faster than anyone acknowledged, and still no one would drive me to the other house or bring the baby to me. When my own mother came to visit, near the end of that first week, I felt something in me loosen just at the sight of her worn face in the doorway. She had walked part of the way and caught a ride the rest, and she came into the warm kitchen and held me longer than usual. Then she pulled back and looked at me, really looked, the way she used to when I was small and hiding something. They let us sit alone only because my mother-in-law was called out to the garden, and even then I felt the house listening. My mother asked how I was healing, and I gave her the answers I was supposed to give. But she kept studying my face, and after a moment she lowered her voice and said the thing I have never forgotten. "Ask to see where the quilt went," she said, "before you thank anyone for anything." I did not understand her then. I thought she meant the quilt was a small matter, a thing to tidy up. Only later did I hear the warning folded inside it, the way she had learned to hide meaning in plain words. I asked her what she meant, but my mother-in-law came back in with a basket of beans, and my mother's face closed like a door. She would say no more with the older woman in the room. She stayed another hour, snapping beans and speaking of ordinary things, and when she left, she pressed my hand hard and told me to mind myself and rest. I walked her as far as the porch. On the step, she paused, glanced back at the window, and said only that some houses in this district had a long memory for who was raised in them, and that I should not let anyone tell me my own daughter was not my concern. Then she went, and I stood in the cold, trying to hold the shape of what she had almost said. That evening, I understood that the arrangement was already known outside our walls. A neighbor woman stopped by with a loaf and, thinking she was being kind, praised the family for their generous care of the little one while I recovered. She said it was a blessing that the child had such steady relations to lean on in a hard time. I smiled and thanked her because that is what you do, but the words landed like stones. Steady relations. A hard time. The whole district had a version of my story already, and in that version, I was the weak mother who needed the baby taken off her hands. No one had asked me for my version. No one thought I had one. I lay awake again that night, doing the cruel arithmetic of it. The neighbor had spoken of the arrangement as something settled and sensible, not as fresh news. That meant the talk had gone around before I ever woke to the empty cradle. People had discussed where my baby would live while I was still carrying her. Somewhere in the quiet of ordinary visits and Sunday dinners, a story had been agreed upon, a story in which I was fragile and the family was merciful, and it had been polished smooth long enough that a neighbor could repeat it without a second thought. I had been the subject of a decision and then the subject of a story, and I had known about neither. The first real doubt about myself crept in around then, and I want to be honest about it because it is the part that shames me most. I began to wonder if they were right. I had lost a child before. I had grieved too long, everyone agreed. Maybe I was fragile. Maybe a steadier woman would not be lying here aching and suspicious. The doubt was a comfortable place to rest because it meant I did not have to fight anyone. For a day or two, I nearly lay down in it. Then I would feel my milk aching or see the empty chest, and something older and truer than the doubt would push me back up. By the end of that week, I understood that asking Erin was useless and asking my mother-in-law was worse, because every question I put to her only fed the story that I was not quite well. If I wanted the truth, I would have to go over their heads or around them to whoever had really decided this. In that household, there was only one person whose word outranked my mother-in-law's, and it was not the bishop, and it was not Erin. It was my mother-in-law herself, sitting at the head of everything, holding the whole family in her two capable hands. If I wanted an answer, I would have to sit down across from her and ask her to her face what she had done with my daughter. I chose a morning when Erin was out with the horses and the younger cousins had been sent to help a neighbor. I found my mother-in-law in her kitchen, the warmest room in the house, with bread rising under a cloth and the kettle low on the stove. She looked up and smiled as if she had been expecting me, and perhaps she had. She poured me tea without asking and set it before me. And the whole scene was so gentle and domestic that for a moment I nearly lost my nerve. Then I thought of the empty cradle and the quilt gone ahead, and I made myself sit down across from her and speak plainly. I told her I wanted to see my daughter, that I was strong enough now, and that I wished to bring the baby home to this house and this room. I said it steadily, without tears, because I had learned that tears in front of her only proved a point I did not want to prove. She listened with her hands folded, nodding a little, and when I finished, she did not say no. She said something far worse. She said that she understood how the birth had unsettled me, that grief and exhaustion could make a mother believe she was ready when she was not, and that I must trust the family to know what I could not yet see clearly in myself. Do you hear what she did there? I did not fully, not then. She took my clear, calm request and returned it to me as a symptom. My wanting my child became proof that I was not well. My steadiness became a kind of confusion I was too confused to notice. Every word she spoke was warm, and every word moved the ground out from under me. When I insisted I was thinking clearly, she said that was exactly what an unwell woman would say, and smiled sadly, as though my very certainty grieved her. I felt myself begin to doubt the floor I stood on, and I understood dimly that this was the point of it. I asked her directly then, whose house is she in? She told me the baby was with a trusted relation, a woman who had raised children well and had room and steady hands and time, everything I lacked while I healed. She spoke of this woman with real warmth, and I could not tell if the warmth was for the woman or for the arrangement. When I asked to be taken there, she said the roads were poor, that I was not fit for the drive, that seeing the baby now would only unsettle us both and set my recovery back. She offered me rest. She offered me patience. She offered me everything except the one thing I had come for, which was my child. Then she made an offer that frightened me more than any refusal could have. She said that if I would only be patient and let myself heal and stop fretting the household with questions, then in time, when everyone could see I was steady, the baby would come home and no one would ever speak of this hard season again. It sounded like mercy. It was a bargain. What she was telling me, underneath the kindness, was that my daughter's return depended on my silence and my compliance, on my performing the calm they had decided I lacked. The more I insisted, the more I proved I was not ready. The more I obeyed, the more I confessed that they had been right to take her. I sat there holding my cooling tea and felt the trap close, clean and quiet, without a single raised voice. If I fought, I was unwell. If I grieved, I was fragile. If I asked questions, I was fretting. The only way to be judged fit for my own daughter was to stop acting like a mother whose daughter had been taken, and the woman across the table believed, I think, that she was being good to me. That was the part I could not get past. She was not cackling over a scheme. She truly seemed to feel she was protecting a delicate girl from her own weakness and protecting the family from the shame of a mother who could not cope. I understood in that kitchen that I would get nothing from her by asking, because asking only fed the story. So I did something I had never done in that house. I lied. I lowered my eyes and thanked her for her care and said that perhaps she was right, that I was tired and not thinking straight, and that I would rest and trust the family. Her whole face eased with relief and approval. "Good girl," she said, and patted my hand, and I sat there letting her believe she had won, while inside I felt the last of my trust in her harden into something cold and clear, and finally, usefully, my own. Because I had realized one thing while she talked her circles around me. She had never once said whose house it was in a way I could follow, but she had said the woman had room and time and had raised children well. And there were only so many such women in our district that the family trusted so completely. If I could not ask my way to the other house, I would find my own way there, on my own legs, without telling a soul. I finished my tea, said I would lie down and climb the stairs slowly. From my window, I could see the roads that led out of the farm, and I began quietly to learn them. The chance came on a wash day, when the household busied itself with steam and baskets, and no one had eyes to spare for me. I had been the picture of obedience for several days, resting, thanking, keeping small, and it had bought me a thin margin of trust. I said I wanted air and would sit on the porch, and no one stopped me. Instead of the porch, I walked, slow and careful, along the lane toward the neighbor's fence line, where I knew an older woman named Esther hung her wash on clear mornings. Esther had helped at my wedding, pinning my dress and fussing over the food, and something in her steady old face had always felt like a place I could set my weight. She was there, as I hoped, pinning sheets to a line that ran between two posts, and she did not startle when she saw me. She only glanced once toward the big house, then went on with her work, and told me quietly to help her hang so it would look like nothing. I understood at once that whatever she had to say could not be said facing me. So I stood beside her and took wet sheets from the basket, and we spoke to the wash line, our hands busy, our faces turned away from any window that might be watching. It was the safest conversation either of us could have, and we both knew it. I told her the baby had been taken to a house I had never seen, and that no one would name it or take me there. Esther pinned a corner and was quiet a long moment. Then she said she was old enough to remember when the same thing had happened before, in the same family, to another young wife. I asked who. She said Aaron's sister, years back, the one whose children had been better off with steadier relations. Only it had not been better, Esther said. The girl had been sound as anyone, but she had grieved a loss too openly, and the family had decided a grieving woman was an unsteady one, and had quietly arranged her children elsewhere until she learned to be quiet. I nearly dropped the sheet in my hands. I had heard the family's version of the sister so many times that it had become a kind of furniture in my mind, a settled fact I never questioned. And here was Esther turning it over to show me its underside. The sister had not been unfit, she had been inconvenient. Her grief had embarrassed a family that prized composure above almost everything. And so the children had been moved to steadier hands, and the story had been arranged around that move until even the neighbors repeated it kindly. It was not a rescue, it was a pattern, and I was standing inside its second turning, holding wet laundry, learning that my story had already been lived once. Esther told me why she had never spoken of it before. Her own daughter-in-law was tied to that family by marriage, and her family's standing in the district leaned on staying in the older woman's good graces. To speak against my mother-in-law was to risk her own household's place. She was telling me now, she said, only because she had watched it happen once and done nothing, and she could not carry the weight of watching it happen twice. Her voice did not shake, but her hands slowed on the line. She was an old woman spending something she could not easily afford, and she knew it, and she did it anyway, and I have never forgotten the cost of that plainness. Before I left, she reached into her apron and pressed something into my palm, folding my fingers over it so no watching eye could see the exchange. It was a small square of cloth, cornflower blue, the exact blue of the quilt I had sewn and lost. I stared at it. Esther said the woman who kept the children, the one at the other house, had shown it to her weeks back while I was still carrying, saying she was making ready, and that a young mother had done fine work on the bedding weeks back while I was still pregnant. Someone had handled my quilt and spoken of the other house before my daughter was ever born, and Esther had held on to this scrap, not knowing what it would come to mean. I walked back to the farm with the scrap of blue closed in my fist, and my whole understanding of the last weeks turned inside out. This was not a decision made in the confusion after a hard birth. The bedding had gone ahead of the baby not by days, but by weeks. The other house had been made ready while I still felt my daughter kicking beneath my ribs. Whatever grief they claimed had unsteadied me, whatever fragility they said the birth revealed, none of it could be the true reason, because the true reason had been settled long before the birth gave them their excuse. The kindness had a schedule, and the schedule started while I was still hoping. The question that had driven me changed shape as I walked. It was no longer only where is the other house, though I meant to find it now more than ever. It was why me, and why so early? What had they seen in me, months before my daughter came, that made them decide she would be raised by someone else? I thought of the measuring stare across the supper table before I ever married in. I thought of my grief over the first loss, watched and weighed and found excessive, and I understood that whatever mark had been set against me, it had been set a long time ago, and my daughter's birth had only started a clock that others had wound in secret. I could not go on not knowing, so I went. I chose the next morning that Aaron drove to the mill, and my mother-in-law took the buggy to a quilting at the far end of the district. The house emptied of the two who watched me hardest, and I told the youngest cousin I meant to nap and shut my door. Then I went down the back stairs, out through the summer kitchen, and onto the road on my own two legs. I had studied the lanes from my window for a week, and Esther's few careful words had told me which direction to walk. My body was not ready for it. I stopped often, one hand on a fence rail, breathing through the ache, but I kept on. It was farther than I expected. A good 2 miles down a rutted lane to a tidy farmhouse I had passed perhaps once and never entered. Smoke rose from the chimney. There was wash on the line and a garden gone to autumn, an ordinary house, the kind you would never look at twice, and my daughter was inside it. I stood at the edge of the yard longer than I should have, gathering myself, and then I walked to the door and knocked before my courage could fail. The woman who answered was near my mother-in-law's age, kind-faced, flower on her hands, and when she saw me, her face did something complicated, part welcome and part alarm, as if she had known this day would come and hoped it would not. She did not turn me away. That is the thing I hold on to, even now. She let me in, and she led me to a small back room, and there in a cradle by the window my daughter slept, pink and whole and near enough to touch. I went to my knees beside her, and spread over her, tucked around her small body, was the quilt. My quilt. Cornflower blue, every stitch mine, the corner where I had matched the scrap Esther held. It was folded and fitted to that cradle as though it had always belonged there, as though the cradle and the quilt and the child had been waiting together in this room for a good while, before any of them needed me. I had believed right up until that moment that the arrangement had been thrown together in the panic after my hard birth. Kneeling there, I saw the truth of it laid out plainly in cloth and wood. The cradle was worn smooth from earlier children. The quilt was settled into it, not fresh from a chest. The little clothes folded on the shelf had been washed and pressed and put by. This room had not been made ready in a morning. It had been made ready over weeks, patiently, the way you prepare for something you are certain will come, and the only person it had been kept from was me, the mother who had sewn the quilt that now covered a bed in a house she had never been allowed to see. The woman stood in the doorway and watched me weep over my sleeping daughter, and she did not stop me from lifting the baby, though her hands twitched as if she wanted to. I asked her, without turning, how long she had known. She was quiet. Then she said the older woman had spoken to her before the harvest, before the baby came, asking if she would take the little one for a time once it was born, so the young mother could heal without strain. She had agreed, she said, because she had been told I was fragile and grieving and might not manage, and because in that family you did not refuse the older woman. She had not thought of it as taking a child. She had thought of it as help. And there, in her plain honest telling, was the whole cruel machine of it. My mother-in-law had not needed to lie outright to anyone. She had only needed to say quietly and early that the young wife was fragile, and let that word do all the work. It made a mother's grief into a diagnosis. It made this good woman's help into a theft she never meant. It made the neighbor's kindness into a chorus that repeated my unfitness until it sounded like fact. No one in the chain had felt themselves cruel. Each had felt themselves merciful. And that, I understood at last, is how a family can take a woman's child without a single hand raised in anger. The woman helped me get the baby latched, and for a little while I nursed my daughter in that borrowed room and let myself feel, fiercely and simply, that she was mine. But even in that relief, a cold new fear was rising. I had come here without leave. I had walked 2 miles I had been forbidden to walk, and I had seen the room they never meant me to see, and I had understood the thing they had gone to such lengths to keep me from understanding. The moment I walked back into the big house, my mother-in-law would know I was no longer the good, grateful, confused girl who had thanked her over cooling tea. She would know I had seen. The woman drove me back part of the way in her cart out of a kindness that felt almost like an apology and let me down where the lane forked so I could walk in alone. I stood a moment watching her go, the scrap of blue and the memory of my daughter's weight both burning in me. I was no longer afraid of being thought fragile. That fear belonged to the girl who had woken to an empty cradle and worried she did not belong. What I feared now was sharper and more useful. They had built this whole quiet machine on the belief that I would never see it working. Now I had seen it, and they were about to find out that a woman who has seen is a very different thing to manage than a woman who only suspects. She knew the moment I walked in. My mother-in-law was back from the quilting early, standing at the window that faced the lane, and she watched me come up it on foot, dust on my hem, hours after I had claimed to be napping behind a shut door. She did not shout. She never shouted. She only looked at me with a new stillness, the warmth gone flat, and said she hoped I had not overtaxed myself, and that a woman who wandered off sick was not showing the steadiness the family hoped to see. Every word was a reminder of the bargain. I had proven by going exactly the unfitness she had claimed, and she let me feel that quietly over supper, without one direct accusation. I want to be honest about why I did not simply take my daughter and leave that day, because from the outside it can look so simple. I had no money of my own, not a dollar that had not passed through that household first. I had no horse, no way to travel far, no home to go to that could shelter a woman and an infant against a family this respected. My own parents' farm could barely feed the mouths already in it, and to bring my troubles there was to bring them down on my father's standing too. And there was the deepest hook of all. If I fought openly and lost, I might lose even the small visits, and the baby might vanish behind that family's good name for good. So I did what women in tight corners have always done. I made myself smaller and quieter than ever, and underneath the quiet I began to work. I let my mother-in-law believe her lesson had landed, that my foolish walk had frightened me back into obedience. I thanked her again. I rested where I was told. And in return, slowly, I won back the one thing I needed, which was permission to visit the other house for the nursing, since even she could not argue forever against a mother's milk without the neighbors wondering. 2 mornings, then 3 a week, I was driven over, and each time I fed my daughter, held her, and quietly, deliberately, built back the bond and the milk they had tried to let fade. Those visits were my whole survival, though I let no one see how much. I learned my daughter's face, the particular fold of her ear, the way she gripped my finger. I timed my body back into rhythm with hers until my milk came strong again, because I understood, without being told, that a nursing mother is harder to argue away than one whose milk has dried. The woman who kept her grew gentler with me each visit, and once, quietly, she told me she had begun to doubt the story she had been given, that I did not seem fragile at all, only fierce and tired. I did not answer, but I filed her doubt away as carefully as I filed everything now, because a witness inside the other house was worth more than gold. Aaron, through all of this, drifted further from me. I had stopped appealing to him, and I think my silence unsettled him more than my arguments ever had. He would sit at the edge of the bed some nights and start to speak and then stop, and I let him stop. Once he said low that it would all be easier if I would only trust his mother's judgment, that she had never steered the family wrong. I looked at him and did not answer, and something in my not answering seemed to shame him, because he did not raise it again. I had loved him in the small, careful way that family allowed, and I grieved what he was choosing, but I had stopped waiting for him to choose me. There came a stretch a few weeks in when I let myself hope. My mother-in-law softened. After a visit where I had been especially calm and grateful, she said almost warmly that I was healing beautifully, and that if I continued so, the baby might come home before the cold set in fully. I lay awake that night nearly dizzy with relief, planning the room, imagining the cradle filled. I let myself believe the bargain was real, that obedience really was the road home. For a few days, I was the most agreeable woman in that house, glowing with the nearness of it. I should have known better. I had already learned that in that family, a softening was never a gift. It was a test. The test showed itself when I asked gently and at what I thought was the right moment. For a date. When, I said, might she come home for good? And my mother-in-law's face cooled by a single degree, and she said, well, that would depend on whether I could show I was truly settled, and there was no need to rush a thing so delicate. The homecoming she had dangled had no date, and never had. It was a carrot on a stick I would chase as long as I kept chasing, and the moment I reached for it, it moved. The hope had not been a promise. It had been a leash, and I had nearly thanked her for holding it. Something in me went very quiet then. Quieter than fear, quieter than grief. I stopped waiting for the family to give my daughter back, because I finally understood they never would, not truly, not while giving her back cost them nothing to keep dangling. The homecoming would stay one good behavior away forever, because a returned child could not be used to keep me obedient. I lay in the dark and let go of the last soft hope that patience would save me, and in its place came a cold, clear certainty that felt almost like relief. No one in that house was going to hand me my motherhood. If I wanted it, I would have to take it, and I would have to be willing to pay whatever taking it cost. The thing that made neutrality impossible came at the close of autumn. My mother-in-law gathered Aaron and a few of the elder relations in the front room one evening and called me in, and I felt the weight of a decision already made before I sat down. She said kindly as always that it was plain the arrangement was working well, that the baby was thriving in the other house, and that everyone agreed it would be best to make it lasting, so the child would have stability and not be shuttled about while I found my footing. She wanted my agreement. She wanted me to say, in front of these witnesses, that I thought it best too, that my daughter should be raised for good by another woman's hands. I understood exactly what was being asked. It was not truly a request. It was a confession they wanted me to sign with my own mouth, the last piece the machine needed. If I said yes, the story would be complete and unassailable, the mother herself agreed. No one could ever call it a taking after that. It would be my choice, spoken before family, and it would bind me forever. And the terrible pull of it was that saying yes was the easy road. It would restore their warmth to me. It would end the cold suppers and the watched walks. It might even, in time, earn me the leftover scraps of visiting. All I had to do was hand over the one thing I had left. They arranged the pressure carefully around me. Aaron sat with his eyes down and said low that it really would be best for everyone, that I should listen to his mother, that no one wanted a fuss. An elder aunt spoke of how blessed the child was to have such steady care. My mother-in-law folded her hands and said she knew I would do what was right for my daughter, and that a good mother always put her child's needs above her own feelings. She had turned it inside out so completely that refusing to give my baby away was made to sound like selfishness, and agreeing to lose her was made to sound like love. I sat in the middle of that warm, reasonable room and felt them all waiting for me to break the right way. But I was not alone in the way they thought. That morning, quietly, two things had reached me. Esther had sent word by way of a shared errand that she would stand by whatever I said was true, that she was done being silent. And my own mother had come the day before and, this time with no older woman in the room, had told me plainly that a mother's grief was not a sickness, that I had never been unfit, and that if I fought she would not let me fight alone, whatever it cost the family's good opinion of her. I carried both of those into that front room like stones in my apron. I was outnumbered in the house. I was not outnumbered in the truth. So when my mother-in-law finished and the room turned to me, waiting, I did not weep and I did not rage. I said clearly that I would not agree. I said the baby was mine, that I had carried her and borne her and fed her, and that no arrangement made without me could decide her life for good. I said I knew the room in the other house had been made ready before she was ever born, and I let that land in the silence. I watched Aaron's head come up. I watched the elder aunt glance at my mother-in-law. I had spoken the one fact they had built the whole gentle story to keep me from ever saying aloud, and now it was said in front of witnesses and could not be unsaid. My mother-in-law recovered quickly, as I knew she would. She made her last, softest move. She said, gently, that I was clearly still unwell to speak so, that grief was talking, and that when I was calmer I would see reason, and be glad the family had been patient with me. It was the same spell that had worked on me for weeks, the one that turned my every clear word into proof of confusion. But it did not work this time, because I had already seen the room, and Esther had already spoken, and my mother stood at my shoulder. I said quietly that I was not confused, and that I would be taking my daughter home, and that anyone who wished to stop me would have to do it openly, where the district could see. The room went cold and still. No one moved to strike me. That is not how that family did things, and I had counted on it. But the warmth was gone for good now, and I felt it close behind me like a door. My mother-in-law said, in a voice gone flat and hard for the first time I had ever heard, that I did not understand what I was throwing away, and that I would find the district did not smile on a wife who defied her family. It was a threat, the first plain one, and I met it plainly. I said I would rather be a mother the district frowned on than a woman who signed her own child away in a warm front room to keep the peace. I walked out before they could wrap the moment back up in reason. My legs shook, but I made them carry me up the stairs, and I packed a small bundle of the baby's things and my own, and I sent the youngest cousin, wide-eyed, to fetch the neighbor with the cart, the woman who kept my daughter and had begun to doubt the story. I had no grand plan and no fortune and no certainty of where I would sleep the following week. What I had was a refusal, spoken aloud and witnessed, and a mother waiting at the fork in the lane, and a scrap of cornflour blue in my pocket. It was not much to build a life on, but it was mine, chosen, and for the first time in a long time, no one had chosen it for me. Here is the whole of it, the answer to the question that had haunted me since I woke to the empty cradle. My daughter had been taken to the home of a trusted older relation, a good woman 2 miles down a rutted lane, and the arrangement had been set in motion by my mother-in-law weeks before the birth, not decided in the aftermath of it. The reason was not my hard delivery and not any true frailty. The reason reached back to the child I had lost in my first year and to the grief I had shown too openly over that loss. My mother-in-law had watched me weep and had decided, quietly, that a woman who grieved like that could not be trusted with the family's next child. That was the hidden motive under all the softness. She was not a monster hoarding a baby. She was a woman who prized composure above nearly everything, who believed the family's standing depended on its steadiness, and who had looked at my open sorrow and seen a threat to the smooth surface she had spent her whole widowhood protecting. To her, moving the child was not cruelty. It was housekeeping. She was tidying away a risk before it could embarrass anyone, and she had dressed the tidying in the language of mercy so thoroughly that she may have half believed it herself. The most frightening people are rarely the ones who know they are doing harm. I learned in the weeks after who had known what and when. Aaron had known before the birth. His mother had told him the plan while I still carried the baby, and he had gone along with it the way he went along with everything she decided, not from malice, but from a lifetime of never once telling her no. Esther had suspected from the start, having watched the same thing done to Aaron's sister years before, but had held her tongue until the weight of a second telling grew heavier than her fear. And my own mother had guessed something was wrong on her first visit, which was why she had told me to ask about the quilt, though even she had not known how far back the planning ran. I will not pretend it ended in triumph, because it did not, and I would not trust anyone who told you these things end clean. I got my daughter home. The neighbor woman, her doubts finally outweighing her deference, drove us both to my parents' farm that first night and quietly told a few of the district women what she had come to believe, and her word carried, because everyone knew she had no reason to lie. The story that I was fragile lost its footing once the woman who had kept the child said plainly that I was not. Enough people came to see it my way that taking the baby again would have cost the family more in reputation than it was worth. But no one apologized. That is the part I have made my peace with slowly. My mother-in-law never once said she had wronged me. She simply let the arrangement fall away as if it had run its natural course and spoke of it afterward, when she spoke of it at all, as a hard season we had all come through together. She kept her standing. She kept her good name. The neighbors, who had praised the family's mercy, did not turn on her. They simply folded the new ending into the old story and moved on. Justice, if that is even the word, did not arrive in any satisfying shape. The machine that had nearly taken my child was not broken. It was only this once denied. Aaron and I did not mend easily, and I will speak of that honestly in what remains. He was not cast out and not condemned. He remained what he had always been, a gentle man caught between the mother who had shaped him and the wife who had finally refused to be shaped. He came with me in the end, which surprised the district and surprised me, but he came slowly and with a grief of his own for the family peace he had lost. Some things between us never fully returned. Trust, once you have watched it choose someone else over you, does not simply grow back because a man stays. We built something quieter afterward, more honest and more careful, but I never forgot that he had known before I did. Now, when I think back to that first morning, the whole scene reads differently to me. The girl who said the baby was settling in nicely at the other house had not been cruel or sly. She had simply repeated, in a child's plain voice, a thing the whole household already treated as settled and ordinary. That was the true horror of it. Plainer than any villain could have been. My daughter's removal had been so normalized, discussed so calmly over so many weeks, that a 14-year-old could mention it to my face and assume I already knew. I had been the last to learn the fate of my own child, and everyone else had grown so used to it that my not knowing seemed the strange part. I have a truer name for it now than I had then. At the time, I only had the family's words, fragile and unsteady and not yet herself, words that made the wrong in it invisible. Now I would call it what it was, which is coercion dressed as concern, the quiet erasure of a mother's authority by people who never once had to raise their voices. It was not a lawful taking, and it was never a kidnapping. It was worse in a way because it wore the face of love and asked me to be grateful for it. And the proof of who I had been all along was the thing that finally came home with me, the cornflower quilt I had stitched for one child, in one room, before anyone decided I was not fit to fill it. Years have passed, and my daughter is a bright, stubborn girl who has never known a night away from me since that first cart ride to her grandparents' farm. We stayed in the community, which surprises people who expect these stories to end with a woman fleeing into the outside world. But this was my home, and my parents were here, and Esther was here, and I decided that leaving would have handed the family the last thing they wanted, which was my absence and my silence. So I stayed, and I raised my child in plain sight, and I let the district watch a mother who had refused to disappear. It was its own quiet kind of answer, lived out over ordinary days rather than spoken in any dramatic scene. What I reclaimed was smaller than a courtroom victory and larger than anything a court could give. I reclaimed the right to answer for my own child. No one asks my mother-in-law now whether the baby may do this or go there or stay home sick from a gathering. They ask me, because I made it plain, day after undramatic day, that the question came to me first, or it did not get answered at all. That authority was always supposed to be mine. I did not win something new. I took back something that had been quietly lifted from my hands while I slept, and I have held onto it since with both hands, the way you hold a thing you nearly lost for good. Not everything mended. My marriage to Aaron is real but careful, a house we rebuilt on a cracked foundation, sound enough to live in but never quite what it might have been. He is a good father, gentler with our daughter than his own upbringing would have predicted, and I think some part of him is trying, without ever saying so, to make up for the morning he carried her out while I slept. We do not speak of that morning. There are still days I look at him and feel the old cold pass through me, and there is the fear I carry that I have never fully set down, the fear of what the family might attempt should we have another child and whether the machine would wake again. I keep the quilt on my daughter's bed to this day. It is worn softer now, the cornflower blue faded toward gray at the folds, mended in 2 corners by my own hand. Some mornings I stand in her doorway and see it settled over her sleeping shape, and I remember the other cradle in the other house where I first found it waiting for a child they meant to raise without me. The same cloth in the room where it always should have been. That is the whole of my story pressed into one plain object, the thing they moved ahead of the truth, now home where I stitched it to be. An empty cradle woke me into this. A filled one is how I measure that it ended. I have thought a great deal about how a thing so wrong could happen with no one shouting and no hand raised. And what I have come to believe is this. Authority that has to be seized back was never truly given in the first place. They let me believe I was a mother by their permission, and permission can always be withdrawn, quietly, in a warm kitchen, with tea and soft words. Real authority over your own child is not a gift a family lends you and takes back when you grieve too loudly. It is yours. And the moment you find yourself asking permission to be what you already are, someone has already begun to take it from you. I am careful when I tell this because I do not want you to think it is the shape of every family in a community like mine, or that softness always hides a snare. Most homes are only homes, but I have learned that control does not always come as a fist. Sometimes it comes as concern, so gentle you thank it while it closes around you. It renames your clear thoughts as confusion, and your fair grief as sickness. And it does this so kindly that you begin to doubt your own steady mind. If any part of that feels familiar to you, in whatever house and whatever life you were raised in, then you already understand the quietest way a person can be made small. I want to say one thing directly to you, and then I will let you go. Trusting your own sense about your own child, your own body, your own mind, is not confusion, no matter how patiently someone insists otherwise. The people in my story were not cartoons of evil. They were sure they knew better than I did what I could bear, and their certainty nearly cost me my daughter. So if there is someone in your life whose care always seems to end with you having less say, I would ask you only to notice it, name it plainly to yourself, and not to mistake being managed for being loved. I would like to know, from those of you who have stayed with me all the way through, what phrase was used on you. What gentle, reasonable words did someone say to overrule you while sounding like they were helping? For your own good. You are not yourself. Trust us. If you are willing, leave it in the comments because I think we would all be a little less alone seeing how alike those phrases turn out to be. I share these stories one careful piece at a time, and if you want to keep sitting with women who were told to stay quiet and chose otherwise, you know where to find me. I will leave you with the plainest truth I own. I stitched that quilt before anyone decided I was not fit to use it, and in the end, it was the proof of who I had been all along. Years have passed, and my daughter is a bright, stubborn girl who has never known a night away from me since that first cart ride to her grandparents' farm. We stayed in the community, which surprises people who expect these stories to end with a woman fleeing into the outside world. But this was my home, and my parents were here, and Esther was here, and I decided that leaving would have handed the family the last thing they wanted, which was my absence and my silence. So I stayed, and I raised my child in plain sight, and I let the district watch a mother who had refused to disappear. It was its own quiet kind of answer, lived out over ordinary days rather than spoken in any dramatic scene. What I reclaimed was smaller than a courtroom victory and larger than anything a court could give. I reclaimed the right to answer for my own child. No one asks my mother-in-law now whether the baby may do this or go there or stay home sick from a gathering. They ask me, because I made it plain, day after undramatic day, that the question came to me first, or it did not get answered at all. That authority was always supposed to be mine. I did not win something new. I took back something that had been quietly lifted from my hands while I slept, and I have held onto it since with both hands, the way you hold a thing you nearly lost for good. Not everything mended. My marriage to Aaron is real but careful, a house we rebuilt on a cracked foundation, sound enough to live in but never quite what it might have been. He is a good father, gentler with our daughter than his own upbringing would have predicted, and I think some part of him is trying, without ever saying so, to make up for the morning he carried her out while I slept. We do not speak of that morning. There are still days I look at him and feel the old cold pass through me, and there is the fear I carry that I have never fully set down, the fear of what the family might attempt should we have another child and whether the machine would wake again. I keep the quilt on my daughter's bed to this day. It is worn softer now, the cornflower blue faded toward gray at the folds, mended in 2 corners by my own hand. Some mornings I stand in her doorway and see it settled over her sleeping shape, and I remember the other cradle in the other house where I first found it waiting for a child they meant to raise without me. The same cloth in the room where it always should have been. That is the whole of my story pressed into one plain object, the thing they moved ahead of the truth, now home where I stitched it to be. An empty cradle woke me into this. A filled one is how I measure that it ended. I have thought a great deal about how a thing so wrong could happen with no one shouting and no hand raised. And what I have come to believe is this. Authority that has to be seized back was never truly given in the first place. They let me believe I was a mother by their permission, and permission can always be withdrawn, quietly, in a warm kitchen, with tea and soft words. Real authority over your own child is not a gift a family lends you and takes back when you grieve too loudly. It is yours. And the moment you find yourself asking permission to be what you already are, someone has already begun to take it from you. I am careful when I tell this because I do not want you to think it is the shape of every family in a community like mine, or that softness always hides a snare. Most homes are only homes, but I have learned that control does not always come as a fist. Sometimes it comes as concern, so gentle you thank it while it closes around you. It renames your clear thoughts as confusion and your fair grief as sickness. And it does this so kindly that you begin to doubt your own steady mind. If any part of that feels familiar to you, in whatever house and whatever life you were raised in, then you already understand the quietest way a person can be made small. I want to say one thing directly to you, and then I will let you go. Trusting your own sense about your own child, your own body, your own mind, is not confusion, no matter how patiently someone insists otherwise. The people in my story were not cartoons of evil. They were sure they knew better than I did what I could bear, and their certainty nearly cost me my daughter. So if there is someone in your life whose care always seems to end with you having less say, I would ask you only to notice it, name it plainly to yourself, and not to mistake being managed for being loved. I would like to know, from those of you who have stayed with me all the way through, what phrase was used on you. What gentle, reasonable words did someone say to overrule you while sounding like they were helping? For your own good. You are not yourself. Trust us. If you are willing, leave it in the comments because I think we would all be a little less alone, seeing how alike those phrases turn out to be. I share these stories one careful piece at a time, and if you want to keep sitting with women who were told to stay quiet and chose otherwise, you know where to find me. I will leave you with the plainest truth I own. I stitched that quilt before anyone decided I was not fit to use it, and in the end, it was the proof of who I had been all along.